Well, we're running a bit late, so I'm going to talk about the health effects of the contamination of the Baltic Sea by radionuclides. I'm Chris Busby. I'm a visiting professor at the University of Ulster and guest researcher at the German Federal Agricultural Research Laboratories in Germany, and also the scientific secretary of the European Committee on Radiation Risk, which is this body here, produced this report on the health effects of low-dose radionuclides this year. This is the second report we've produced, and it's interesting in that it has, in an appendix to this report, it has a declaration by 20 very eminent scientists from all over the world. And this declaration states that the current risk model of the International Commission on Radiological Protection, which for a long time was based in Sweden, which is why I'm in Sweden, because Sweden is a very important place for radiation protection, that this model is incorrect by a very large amount when it comes to assessing the effects of internal radionuclides, substances which are inhaled or which are ingested in some way and end up inside the body. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this risk model, if I can get this system to work, because it's not quite one that I understand. And then, when I've talked about the risk model and about the health effects of these radioactive substances, it's got some peculiar system here. I know how it works, but it's, you know, you can't just click on it, you have to kind of...
För den där pilarna ner.
No, you have to click on that.
Flytta på den.
Yeah, that's how it works. Yeah. So this is going to be in three parts, really. The first, one part is going to be about the health, about the error in the risk model for assessing the health effects of internal radionuclides. And actually, this is the most important part of my talk, because it draws attention to what is probably the most serious public health scandal of all time, of human history, recorded human history. Because in a sort of science-assisted collision with reality, the people who made atomic bombs in the 1950s, in order to enable them to continue making atomic bombs and create the pollution that's associated with those atomic bombs, they developed a risk model which is still in place, and one which was horribly wrong for a lot of radioactive substances, because it was based on physics and not based on biology or chemistry, and on the ways in which these substances, which are all chemicals, and they all have chemical properties, how they move inside the human body or inside living systems, and how they interact with those parts of living systems which keep the living systems alive and keep them happy and well. So first of all, I'll tell you something which no doubt you've heard as a result of this Baltic Sea tour, that the Baltic Sea...
Det är bättre att det är som det är nu och det inte slutar göra saker. Det stör när det håller på grejer.
So I'm going to try, and then when I've talked, so these are the three things. So about the radioactivity of the Baltic Sea, the risk model. The third thing, because a lot of people have come here to hear about this, is a recent study which I carried out with some colleagues on the population of Fallujah in Iraq. This study has been covered by all of the major news networks now. It's all over the internet, and it's had an enormous amount of publicity. And quite rightly too, because it's the first scientific study that shows the health effects of the use of novel weapons, new weapons in Fallujah, Iraq. But I'll start with the Baltic Sea. Some years ago I discovered, from looking at data that was given to me by Per Hegeland originally, that the Baltic Sea is actually the most radioactive sea in the world. And the reason for this is fairly straightforward. It's because the Baltic Sea is actually not a sea at all. It's like a very large lake. It's almost totally enclosed. And the transfer of salt water from the Atlantic and from the British North Sea into the Baltic is very, very limited. And so whatever ends up in the Baltic Sea stays there. And you can see from this map, which is a map from HELCOM, These circles represent the concentrations of cesium-137 in becquerels per square meter. You can see the largest ones there are off the coast of northern Sweden, and there are ones also off the coast of Latvia and at the southern end of Finland in the Gulf of Estonia. And the levels there are up to 100,000 becquerels per square meter. And if you know what you can see what a square meter is, about this much. This is sediment, so this is like the beach. And there's your sediment. And the number of disintegrations per second in that sediment of cesium-137, a radioactive substance from Chernobyl, are 100,000 disintegrations per second. So every second there are 100,000 little explosions in that sediment. And this is gamma radiation. So if you're sitting on that sediment, this gamma radiation, this 100,000 disintegrations is passing through your body. And it's doing a lot of harm to it, of course. But much more serious is the harm that is done to it if this material becomes resuspended by wave action, when the waves come crashing in and they turn this stuff over and they throw it up in the air and it travels inland.
Could you give them a comparison figure, like before Chernobyl, 300 becquerel was allowed in a kilo of, or in the radiator, and after 1500?
Oh yes.
What does it compare?
But listen, I'm not going to get anywhere, Roland, if you keep interrupting me, because I've got a lot to go through, okay? And maybe I'm not going to get it all right, but then you can maybe ask the questions afterwards, because if I don't follow it through and I keep stopping like this, we're not going to get anywhere. So could you give me the next slide? No, you have to. Okay, well this is more or less answering Roland's question, is the distribution of cesium-137 by year. So 1960, 64, 68, 72, 76, 80, 84, and suddenly you see it goes up. So it means that a lot of this radioactivity is from Chernobyl, and that's straightforward. These are measurements made, historic measurements made by Hellman. Next slide. And I think we don't need to bother with this. This is what I told you, that the outflow rates are very low and the inflow rates are very low. So next slide. Now, this is Chernobyl. You can see these are maps from the European Union and from the IAEA originally, but you can see that the Chernobyl radiation went north through Latvia and then over through Finland and then down into Sweden. I think you know that Sweden received quite a lot of radiation from Chernobyl. But I have to say that the radioactivity in the Baltic Sea is not all from Chernobyl. A significant quantity of radiation came down from the atomic weapons test fallout that the Americans and the Russians and the English and the French have done in the atmosphere between 1952 and 1960. Well, actually for the French later on, but there was a treaty, a test ban treaty in 1963, signed by President Kennedy just before he was assassinated. Okay, now the material, the kind of material produced by Chernobyl is in the form of particles. This is a photomicrograph, it's an autoradiograph of a lady's dress, a lady who came back from Kiev about 1 month after the Chernobyl accident, and they took her dress and they cut it up and they put it next to a photographic plate. And so you can see that these are particles. These are actually radioactive particles that were in the air. Now you can't see these particles, they're very small. They just float through the air and they float around and you inhale them. And then they end up in the Baltic Sea. But in the Baltic Sea they still are particles, and the uranium particles are really quite insoluble. So these are particles of fission products loaded with a whole range of fission product isotopes. Next slide. The fact that they're particles is important. Now, in order to understand what health effect this has had, we can't really look to Belarus and we can't look to the ex-Soviet Union territories because there was a huge cover-up of the effects by the International Atomic Energy Agency. The World Health Organization were not permitted to do research in Belarus and in the Ukraine or in Russia. It is in their charter, which they signed an agreement in 1959 with the International Atomic Energy Agency to leave all of these measurements on health, radioactivity and health to the IAEA, who are, after all, the developers of nuclear energy. So this is a serious conflict of interest, which is still in place. But Tondel, and this is a terribly important study, and this person should be given a prize, this young man, Martin Tondel, for doing his PhD on the levels of cancer in northern Sweden. In 2004, he started to look at the health effects of the Chernobyl accident, and he examined areas of Sweden that had small areas of Sweden that had different levels of cesium-137 in municipalities, and he found a significant epidemiological correlation between the cancer incidence rates and radioactive contamination. Next slide. And this is his paper, which he published in 2004 with other members of, with his supervisor and various other people that worked with him. And he found that there was an 11% increase. Here we have 11% excess relative risk is 0.11 per 100 kilobecquerels per square meter of cesium. Next slide. Now that number you can turn into an error in the current risk model. And when you do this, you find that the risk model is in error by at least 600 times. At least 600 times. It's not a small number. But it's an interesting number because it comes up again and again. It comes up in the assessment of childhood leukemia near nuclear sites, which a big study has been done in Germany in the last 5 years, and also many other examination of the health effects of internal radionuclides, including ones that I've done, come up with this sort of number, about 600 to 1,000 times. And you might wonder, how is it possible that such a ridiculous mistake could have been made? Of course, he was attacked by the radiation risk community, and particularly he was removed from his work on radiation by his boss, whose name is Lars Erik Holm, who happens to be the current medical officer of health for Sweden. Now, you may want to know that Lars Erik Holm was actually, before he became promoted to the medical officer of health for Sweden, he was the head, the president of the International Commission on Radiological Protection. So he was the man who was responsible for the risk model that was wrong. This man. Next slide. There he is. Okay? And he has famously gone on record several times in saying that the health effects of the Chernobyl accident are zero. It's restricted to a few cleanup workers who happen to walk into so much radiation that basically they turn into crisps. And everybody else is fine. But you need only to talk to the people who come from Belarus or from the scientists who work there, who are colleagues of mine, Professor Bandashevsky, Professor Malko, Professor Goncharova. These people will tell you the real health effects of the Chernobyl accident in Belarus. Never mind about the Ukraine and other places, and indeed in Europe, and as we now know, in Sweden also. So the Chernobyl radioactivity washes to the Baltic Sea, and it ends up in the sediments. Next slide. Okay, this is what I did. Because I'm concerned about the health effects of radionuclides in coastal communities, which I've studied in several nuclear sites in the United Kingdom and in the Irish Sea, which is contaminated by material from Sellafield. All the same stuff, radionuclides from nuclear power. And what I did was I looked at the counties, because you cannot get municipality data, they will not give it to you. I asked them in Helsinki for data for the small areas of Finland and in Sweden also. You cannot get hold of this data. Tondel got it by going through lots and lots and lots of ethical committees, and eventually they gave it to him. But the probability of them giving it to me is because they know what I'll do with it. But anyway, what I did with this was to look at the counties, because the county data is interesting as well, and that is available on the internet. They have a big website, you can find the county data. So I looked at all of the counties near the sea, these ones. These are the ones near the sea. And then I compared them with the ones that were inland, because obviously if the seacoast effect is real, if this radioactive Baltic Sea is causing increases in cancer near the sea, then we would expect to see some difference, possibly, in counties that were near the sea compared to counties that were not near the sea. This is a reasonable hypothesis which we can investigate. And so I compared 2 years before, 3 years before Chernobyl. Unlike Tondel, who just looked at all of the time after Chernobyl, I was concerned to see what happened between after Chernobyl and before Chernobyl, you see. So I looked at 3 years before Chernobyl, next slide, and compared them with the after Chernobyl. So no, it wasn't 3 years, it was 2 years. 84 and 85. And these are the rates, the relative risks. These are age standardized and social class standardized. They're all available on the internet from the Swedish Cancer Registry. And so if we compare 84 and 85, these are these are the inland counties here, and those are the Baltic Sea counties there. And you can see these are the relative risks as you go along for breast cancer. I use breast cancer because that's a very, very good indicator for radiation effects. I found in the Irish Sea, I found around nucleus, 2 nuclear sites in England, that breast cancer is a fantastically good indicator. So I looked at breast cancer, and what I found is that these red ones here are the average numbers for before, and those ones there are the average numbers for afterwards. And what I'm doing now is I'm comparing the afterwards, these red ones on the right. This is for the mean of 88, 89, 90 and 91, with the mean of 84 and 85. And what we find is that for all of the counties that were near the sea, you get an increase. And the increase is generally highest for the ones that have the biggest seaboard. So you can see there, this one, you know these more than I do, but you can see this one, Blekinge, is that how you say it? That's got almost entirely seaboard. That one is very close to the sea, and you can see it's got the highest increase of all, 28% increase of breast cancer after Chernobyl. But interestingly, the inland counties, which received a lot of the Chernobyl radiation, I have to say, that a lot of the cesium fell with the rain on the inland counties. You see there's actually a reduction. So breast cancer fell after Chernobyl. It fell after Chernobyl in the inland counties, and it increased after Chernobyl in the seacoast counties. Next slide. So this is not surprising because I have already seen this in Wales. This is my study of the Irish Sea. This is the Irish Sea, very similar, except that it's not quite so landlocked. And Sellafield is up there where it says 0.5, up in the top bit there. So next slide. And what you find in the Irish Sea, as I'm sure you find in the Baltic, is that the sediment is contaminated. And this, in the Irish Sea, you have a much bigger tide than the Baltic. The Baltic's got a very small tide, but the Irish has got a big tide. And so when the tide is out, you uncover these big mud flats. And you can measure the radioactivity in the mud flats. And in a number of studies we've shown, and in this particular mud flats, we found there was about a 4-fold excess of child leukemia in the period 1965 to 85. And inside this mud flat is plutonium and cesium and strontium and all of the usual stuff. Next slide. Now what we found, oh yes, this is interesting. This one here is a core. So it's a mud core. What you do is you go to the sediment and you take a piece of hose pipe and you knock it down into the sediment, and then you dig around it and you take out a core of mud, yeah? And then you put it in the freezer till it's frozen, then you saw it in half, so you've got like half of a core, and you put a photographic plate onto it, and this is what you see. You see again these particles. This is what we're concerned about. These are these radioactive particles, just like the radioactive particles in the skirt from the woman from Chernobyl, the English woman. Now this is the concentration of plutonium by distance from the Irish Sea on the English side. And these are kilometers. So that's 1 kilometer, 2 kilometers, 3 kilometers, and so on. And so you can see that the concentration of plutonium in the air, and they measured this. These are the results. These are measured results. They hung out a big sheet, and they left it there for a long time, and then they took it away, put it in an oven, turned it into ash, measured the plutonium. You see that most of the plutonium falls out. This is a logarithmic scale. Look, 10, 10 squared, 10 cubed. So very, very sharply the plutonium falls out in the first kilometre. And you need to remember that because we're going to show you some more results from studying the risk factor by distance from the sea. Next one. The first one of these we did. Okay, next one. Oh no, we missed one. I think there was one with a map. Go back one.
There's a map here.
No, this one here. That little arrow, doesn't it?
Yes, but going backwards, you said.
Yeah, that goes back. Oh no, it doesn't, goes forward.
That one goes forward, but that one doesn't.
Oh, that's a bit sad.
That is west of the start.
Okay, back altogether. We'll have to, I think I'm looking for a map of Carlingford because we did a house-to-house survey in Carlingford where those mud flats were.
It's not this one.
No, keep going. No. It's a coloured map.
That was
No, keep going.
Nej, gå vidare nu. Nästa.
No, that is it, yeah, okay. Well, these are the small areas of Wales that we looked at. We'll have, the Carlingford one must be somewhere else. We'll come to it. So we looked at these small areas. Next slide. And this is what we found. So we looked at, each one of these circles represents a small municipality in Wales. And so what we're looking at is the cancer risk by distance from the sea. And this is the average distance from the sea of these municipalities, 10, 20, 30, 40 kilometers away from the sea in that map. And those bubble plots there, they represent the raw data. And we then split these municipalities into different distances. So you see there's from 0 to 0.8, then 0.9 to 2, and so on. So these are distances, average distances of a group of about 15 to 20 of these municipalities to get an average. And when you do that, you find there's a sharp increase in cancer as you get very close to the sea. And that was quite unexpected. We didn't know what to look for, but when we found it, it was before we saw that graph of the plutonium by distance from the sea. So at the time that we saw this, we couldn't quite understand what was happening. It was only when we saw the plutonium increases that we realized that these people were inhaling the radioactivity that got driven ashore. And this was the reason for their increase in cancer. Next slide. And we found this in Wales wherever we looked. Can we have the next slide? Right, so for all cancers, you see, all different types of cancer, we have the same effect. These are exponential, these are like a mathematical description of what we're finding for all these different kinds of cancer. So we find it for leukemia, for breast cancer, for lung cancer, for colon cancer, and in fact those are just the ones we plotted. So in fact every single cancer type we found went up very suddenly as you got close to the sea. And if you were thinking it was maybe, somebody suggested in the government when we were talking about this, that they said the kind of person who lives by the sea is more likely to get cancer because it's their personality. And it's not as stupid as it sounds, because we know that there are types of people that get cancer and it is their personality. So we did decide to follow that up. And we looked at areas of the seaside which were more or less radioactive. And that's the obvious way to deal with that. And we found that in those parts of the seaside where there was more radioactivity, we found a higher rate of cancer. So that dealt with the problem about people being prone to cancer because they live near the seaside. Next slide. And it was very high in children too. And in fact, in another study, which I haven't got time to show you, we followed up the childhood cancer, and we found that by 2004, this effect had resulted in an increased relative risk of childhood cancer near the coast in North Wales of about 18 to 20 times. So we're talking about a very, very big effect here, very big effect. So next slide. So now we want to briefly go on to how this can possibly be. And this is, like I said before, because of this error in the International Commission of Radiological Protection model. And this model has been now supplanted, and the explanation, the much better explanation than I can give you in the time that's available now, is all available in the publications of the ECRR. And this is the latest one. So this is a description of the whole risk model problem and how it came about. And the next slide. This ECRR is now becoming quite big. This is the latest. Yeah, next one. All right, so how is it that this came about? Well, it came about, very briefly, it came about because the risk for radiation is modelled almost entirely on external radiation from the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And that was an extremely high dose gamma radiation exposure, enormously high. I mean, most of the people were killed by the amount of radiation there was there. But it was an external radiation dose, so every single cell in the body got the same amount of energy. So the number of ionizations, and it is ionizations at the DNA that cause the effects that we're looking for. This is genetic damage effects. It's genetic damage that's causing cancer and all the other effects of radiation. Radiation is genotoxic. It's a genetic damage agent. And as I said, these health effects are modelled on the basis of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. And these models are completely silent. They say nothing about internal radiation. Because in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki situation, both the control groups and the people who were irradiated got internal radiation. So this model is only any good for external radiation. So when you go and have an X-ray, or if you have 10 X-rays or 50 X-rays, it will tell you pretty accurately whether you're going to get cancer or not, or what the probability is. But if you start to eat some plutonium, forget it. And there are various other problems associated with it. But essentially, it's based on the assumption that all of the cells in the body receive the same amount of ionization, the same number of tracks. And this is not valid for internal radiation. Next slide. Yes, so you can see here, this is a phantom. This is called the ICRP phantom. This is how they calculate radiation dose. But you can see everything is diluted into a large tank of water shaped like a human being. Now that method will give the same dose for warming yourself in front of a fire as sitting and eating a hot coal. The dose will be the same. Under the ICRP risk model, it will be the same. Because that amount of radiation energy is diluted into the whole of the body, or into the whole of the organ. So you could eat a hot coal and that amount of energy would be diluted into the body, or you could take that coal and dissolve it in a whole tank of water and then sit in the water, and that would be the same amount of energy. So you can see this is how we've had this error of 600 or 1,000 times. Because once you see it like that, it's quite easy to see the error of 600 and 1,000 times. Because essentially, it's like the difference between the size of the tank of water that you put the coal into and the actual area of the body where the coal is heating it up. Next slide. Yes, well, I think I've just said that. And again. And again. And again. Yeah, this is the ICRP model. And again. This model, incidentally, a new version of this model came out in 2007. And the editor of this model I met with here in Stockholm last year. And he admitted that this model was wrong for internal radionuclides. We've got all this on video. So they know that the model is wrong, yet it's still being employed. So, as I say, the Baltic Sea, so these are the conclusions of this. The current risk model is out by 1,000. The Baltic Sea is contaminated, and people are dying. So that's end of part one. Now, part two. Part two is about Fallujah. And I haven't got a lot of time about this, but I'll just briefly go through yeah, we need to find this one. One of these is this is it, yeah, okay. All right, let's get that up. Right, where did it come up?
Oh, you want the first page?
Yeah. No, it's not that one. It's a word for it.
Yeah, that's true.